My name is Elijah Moore. I'm 41 years old. I run a quiet consulting firm that works behind the scenes for tech companies you've probably never heard of. But trust me, their CEOs know my name. I've never been flashy, never posted my income, never bragged. I just put my head down, delivered results, and watched the numbers grow. $130,000 a year. Clean, efficient, all on paper. And no one, not even my wife, knew the full picture. 3 months ago, I was in the hospital. A sudden infection, complications after a minor surgery. It hit hard. I was weak, could barely speak for a few days. She visited at first, sat by the window scrolling her phone, told the nurses she'd be back later. But as the days dragged on, her visits stopped. I chalked it up to stress. We had been growing distant, yes. But divorce, that wasn't on my radar, until I found out from a nurse, yes, a nurse, that my wife had changed her last name, not legally, just online. She said, "Oh, you must be proud, your wife just got married again." I blinked, still groggy. Not sure I heard her right. Married again? But we weren't even divorced, or so I thought. When I finally checked my messages and accounts, the truth hit like a second illness. She had filed for divorce while I was in that hospital bed, quietly, efficiently, and just 2 months later, she married my brother, my younger brother, the one I had mentored, loaned money to, trusted with everything. They hadn't even hidden it. Photos, tags, posts full of smiles. While I lay healing, they were celebrating. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was their assumption that I had nothing, that because I wasn't loud about my wealth, I must have been broke. That they were walking away from a sick man, not a silent force. That miscalculation would cost them everything. And I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't send a single angry text. I'd do exactly what I had always done, move quietly, think clearly, and build something that would make them wish they had left me in peace. Lying in that hospital bed, I didn't feel rage. I felt silence. A kind of quiet that seeps into your bones and teaches you who you really are. My wife, no, my ex-wife now, had decided I was disposable, and my brother, he wasn't just a thief of trust. He was a man who mistook my stillness for weakness. What they didn't know was that I had spent the last decade mastering 2 things, systems and timing, and now both were on my side. I had always kept my finances separate, not out of secrecy, but out of discipline. My consulting business was registered in my name only. My savings accounts, investments, and property shares were all under legal protection. She never asked, and I never offered. She assumed what she didn't see didn't exist. And that assumption had just made her sign away the very life she thought she was entitled to. When I got out of the hospital, I didn't tell anyone. I recovered in silence, rented a temporary apartment downtown. Simple, clean, anonymous. I didn't call my parents. Didn't ask questions. I already knew what I needed to know. She and my brother were legally married now, and she had walked away with nothing. The way she filed the divorce, she waived any claim to alimony, probably because she thought there was nothing to gain. That was her first mistake. I sat at my desk, pulled out my journal, and started making a list, not of revenge, but of leverage, not out of emotion, but clarity. I still had shares in my brother's startup, quiet, early-stage support. I gave him when no one else believed in him. I had signed paperwork, IP access, even domain control for one of his most public-facing platforms. He had asked for my help when his business was just an idea, and I had delivered without asking for credit. Now he owed me everything. I could have sued. I could have frozen his operations with a single letter, but that would have been loud, and loud wasn't my style. No, I'd do what I've always done. Let the weight of facts collapse the illusion they built. While they planned weddings and posed for photos, I was preparing something far more permanent. And the beauty of it all, they still didn't know I was watching. I started with the business records, not out of pettiness, but precision. My brother had always been a dreamer, but when it came to legal structure, he was careless. The startup he launched, now mildly successful, still had me listed as a co-founder on the LLC. I had invested seed capital, written the code for his back-end systems, and owned the domain name. He'd forgotten, or maybe assumed I wouldn't care. But ownership doesn't disappear just because the relationship does. I contacted a legal firm I'd used in the past, discreet professionals, no dramatic lawsuits, just paperwork, strategy, control. I asked them to quietly review the terms of my ownership and prepare a restructuring request. If he wanted to continue using what I had built, he'd have to renegotiate. Not because I wanted to ruin him, because I was done being invisible. Then I turned to my finances. For over 8 years, I had made just under $11,000 a month through my consulting retainers, royalties, and partnerships. I had lived well below my means. No sports car, no bragging, just a thick investment portfolio, a rental property in Austin, and a quiet holding company that funneled everything. My ex-wife never saw any of it. She thought the hospital bills had drained me. She had no idea I had paid them in full out of one of my smaller accounts. I also reached out to a friend who worked in digital marketing. Let's rebuild the website, I told him. Fresh brand, new content, subtle edge. We rebranded my consulting work to look exactly like what it had become. High level, clean, out of reach for small minds. Within 2 weeks, I had a feature in a mid-tier entrepreneur magazine and 2 podcast invites. No announcement, no gloating. Just quiet, deliberate exposure. Meanwhile, I heard things. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned my brother was having trouble with investors. He'd overpromised during their expansion phase, and cracks were forming. My silence, my ownership stake, was a shadow hanging over his operation. He had no idea when or if I'd act. That uncertainty. It was enough to start unraveling his confidence. And her? She wasn't enjoying the fairy tale either. Word was, she had quit her job to build a brand with him. But with funding tightening and tension rising, the sparkle had started to dim. Their housewarming posts stopped. Their couple content dried up. What began as a betrayal now looked more like a slow-motion collapse. And I hadn't said a word. I was simply doing what I always did, building in silence, planning beneath the noise. Only now, the outcome wasn't just success, it was justice. I received an email from my brother one morning. Short, hesitant. "Hey man, can we talk?" No subject line, no context, just a weak thread tossed into the silence. I didn't reply right away. I let it sit. I wanted him to feel the weight of wondering, something I had lived with in a hospital bed while they exchanged vows behind my back. He was learning now that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it's surveillance. Days later, another email came. This one longer. He was concerned about the business. Mentioned legal documents he forgot I had signed. Asked if I'd be open to a buyout. I could feel the anxiety bleeding through the screen, that edge of panic when someone realizes they've built their empire on someone else's foundation. And now the landlord is knocking. I consulted my lawyer. "We'll respond with terms," I said. "Firm, fair, and non-negotiable." The offer we sent wasn't about greed. It was about dignity, a clean severing, priced exactly at what my contribution was worth, and a little extra for the silence I had maintained. It was a sum large enough to sting, but legal enough that they couldn't paint me as vindictive. I wanted no drama, just distance, enforced by contract. He tried to call, I let it ring. Meanwhile, I heard whispers that my ex-wife, now his wife, was unraveling. She had been hoping for a power couple image, brand deals, influence. But now she was sitting beside a man who couldn't sleep, who spent more time buried in contracts than in compliments. The shine of betrayal fades quickly when the world doesn't celebrate it, and she had built her future on a fantasy, one that was quietly folding. I walked past their favorite cafe one morning, saw her through the window, sitting alone, eyes on her phone, no glow, no pride, just a flicker of someone who had realized the cost of choosing appearance over substance. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I just kept walking, the sound of my shoes the only answer she'd get from me now. Because the truth is, you don't need to confront the people who broke you. You just need to rise so completely that their version of the story no longer holds power, and I was almost there. Almost ready to close the chapter, not with fire, but with quiet, undeniable freedom. The buyout went through, clean, quiet. I received the wire transfer in full 6 figures, no delay. My brother didn't fight it. He couldn't. The paperwork was airtight, and his investors had started asking questions. He needed control of the company back to keep their trust. So, he signed the documents, sent the money, and in doing so, gave me the last word, without either of us speaking a single one out loud. It wasn't about the money, though. Not really. It was about being seen. About watching the very people who dismissed you come face to face with the reality they tried to ignore. My brother had underestimated me, the same way my ex-wife had, but now, every signature he placed on that contract was a silent admission. I had built something he couldn't outrun. She never reached out directly. Not a message, not a word, but I knew she watched. The new consulting website, the articles, the podcast episodes, I could see her name pop up occasionally in the back-end analytics. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't end when they leave. It ends when they realize you were never the one who lost. I didn't respond. I never will. There's nothing to say to someone who thought your silence was emptiness. She had walked away from a man who was worth more than she could ever measure, because I didn't measure it out loud. She chose convenience, spectacle, and status over loyalty, and in return she got chaos, fading attention, and a husband unraveling under pressure. The irony. The ring I gave her years ago, simple, modest, thoughtful, was worth more now than their entire marriage. Not in money, but in meaning. That ring had come from a place of depth, of patience, of truth. And she traded it for a spotlight that blinked out the moment things got real. As for me, I didn't need closure. I had creation. I had rebuilt everything they tried to walk away from, stronger, sharper, and sealed off from anyone who couldn't see value in stillness. I didn't just win, I endured. And in the world of betrayal, endurance is the highest form of justice. After the buyout, I moved into a new place. Not lavish, just intentional. Everything in it reflected who I had become. Clean lines, deep colors, shelves lined with books I actually read. No more compromises. No more pretending to be small so others could feel big. This space, like my life, was finally mine. Fully, quietly, mine. I took a sabbatical. Not to disappear, but to recenter. I traveled to places I once dreamed about. Spent 3 weeks in Kyoto, walked alone through the Swiss Alps, sat on the coast of Amalfi with a notebook and no schedule. For the first time in years, I felt no pressure to be on, no need to explain where I'd been or what I'd lost. Because I hadn't lost. I had been refined. The people who knew me before barely recognized me now. I moved differently, spoke less, listened more. There's something unshakable that comes from surviving betrayal without bitterness. You become a mirror. People either face themselves in your presence or they walk away. Either way, you remain whole. She and my brother faded from relevance. Their wedding posts dried up. Her social pages became curated silence. His startup plateaued. Without my systems behind it, without the structure I built, they were just noise without signal. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. I simply watched from a distance as their momentum collapsed under the weight of what they didn't understand. One morning, I received a letter, handwritten, no name on the envelope, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My ex-wife. The letter was careful, almost literary in its regret. She didn't ask for anything. She just said, "I didn't know how much you were carrying, or how little I was offering in return." I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not because I needed to remember her, but because I wanted to remember who I used to be and how far I had come. By the end of the year, I had built something new. A private equity circle for underfunded solo entrepreneurs. People who had great ideas but no access to support. I called it Quiet Fire. A tribute to those who, like me, burned without making a sound. The people who were underestimated, overlooked, or abandoned, and yet kept building. I hired a small team. People who'd been through storms of their own. We didn't do hype. We did work. And within 6 months, we had helped launch 5 startups and scaled 2 existing companies. No viral headlines, just real lives changed. That's what mattered now. One evening at a private industry dinner, I saw her, my ex-wife. She was there with a fashion rep, trying to pitch her personal brand. Our eyes met across the room. She looked away first, not because I stared, but because I didn't. There's a pain in being invisible to the person you once thought you could manipulate. She felt it then. I left before dessert, not to avoid her, but because there was nothing left to prove. I had nothing to say, and that silence echoed louder than any confrontation ever could. Some people come back because they regret what they did. Others come back because what they replaced you with collapsed. Either way, I wasn't returning. I met someone unexpectedly. Her name was Harper. She wasn't flashy, no curated feed, no obsession with optics. She worked in product design, ran a small wellness brand on the side, and read philosophy for fun. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, and not once did she ask what I did for a living. That's how I knew she was different. She wasn't impressed by resumes. She was drawn to stillness, to presence, to truth. She told me once, "You move like someone who knows what silence costs." I smiled. "I paid in full," I said, and she understood. We didn't rush. No labels, no declarations, just shared time. Simple moments. Coffee, long drives, unfiltered honesty. And with her, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Ease. Not the adrenaline of being desired, but the safety of being known. When I eventually told her the story, my ex-wife, my brother, the hospital, the silence, she didn't gasp. She listened. She held my hand and said, "That story didn't break you. It built your clarity." And that clarity is what I now offer her. Every day, no masks, no performance. Just presence. I never thought I'd love again. Not like this. But when you stop seeking validation, love doesn't have to be loud. It can be soft, strong, and real. My family held a reunion the following summer. I was invited, of course. My parents had long since realized what had happened between my brother and me. They tried to remain neutral, but blood doesn't cover betrayal. I almost didn't go. But Harper encouraged me to consider. "You don't need to go for them," she said. "You can go for you." I arrived late. Wore grey, kept to the edges. My brother saw me from across the lawn. He didn't move. His posture changed. Shoulders dipped, hands tucked in his pockets. He didn't come over. He didn't have to. I had already said everything I needed to say by thriving in his absence. We didn't speak, not once, and that silence between us, it said more than apologies ever could. He knew what he had done, he knew what it cost him, and he knew he could never come back from it. That was enough for me. I spent time with my parents, laughed with old cousins, introduced Harper to a few relatives I actually liked. We left early, quietly, just as we came. No scene, no confrontation, just a quiet man, reclaiming the spaces that were once taken from him. When I got home, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. I had faced the past, not to correct it, but to prove I had moved so far beyond it, it no longer had a hold on me. A few weeks ago, I learned that my brother and my ex-wife had separated. No announcement, just subtle changes: profiles wiped, last names reversed, mutual friends whispering. I didn't feel anything. No triumph, no relief, just confirmation of what I had known all along. A house built on betrayal will eventually collapse under its own roof. She tried to reach out again, this time through a mutual friend. She wants to apologize properly, he said. She says she finally sees who you really were. I smiled. She's seeing who I still am, I replied, and she's not invited anymore. I didn't take revenge, I reclaimed. I didn't destroy, I rebuilt, and in doing so, I became the one thing they never expected: a man who walked away without looking back. Not because he was weak, but because he had already won. Now I live on my terms. I choose who enters my circle. I protect my peace like it's gold, because it is. I don't need to be seen, applauded, or proven right. I just need to be honest, present, whole. To anyone listening, anyone who's been betrayed while they were down, who's been abandoned when they were most vulnerable, this is your reminder: your story isn't over. It's just waiting for the chapter where you rise. And when you do, let your silence speak louder than your scars. A journalist reached out one afternoon. She was writing a feature on unseen leaders, people who made major industry shifts without ever becoming influencers. I was hesitant. I hadn't told this story to anyone publicly. Not the hospital, not the betrayal, not the silence, but something in me knew it was time. Not to shame anyone, but to show what healing could look like after devastation. We met in a quiet cafe, one with tall windows and soft light. I told her my story not as a victim, not with bitterness but with honesty. The details weren't gory. I didn't name names. I simply spoke of the moment I was left behind, the months I stayed silent, and the slow return of my own voice. She listened, wide-eyed, taking notes gently, asking thoughtful questions. The article came out a month later. It didn't go viral, but it went deep. Messages poured in from people around the world, people who'd been left while they were sick, betrayed by family, laughed at for being too quiet. They said, "Your silence gave me courage," and for the first time I realized maybe my story wasn't just mine anymore. My inbox filled with podcast requests, book deals, speaking invitations. But I wasn't interested in fame. I had already learned that real power moves in whispers. So I chose one interview, just one. A podcast that focused on resilience over revenge. I told my story again, this time with Harper sitting just outside the frame, her presence grounding me. When the episode aired, I didn't watch the comments. I didn't check the metrics. I went for a walk, because I had said what I needed to say. Not to be understood, but to be free. And in that walk, I realized something deeper than revenge. I had transformed my pain into permission for others to rise too. And that was worth far more than any spotlight they once stole from me. A friend from my hometown ran into my brother. They hadn't seen each other in years. Over coffee, my brother tried to rewrite history, said things like, "It wasn't as bad as it looked," or "We just fell in love and didn't know how to handle it." He painted himself as confused, pressured, even innocent. My friend just nodded and said nothing, because what could he say to a man who still couldn't look in the mirror? That's what people like them do. They rewrite, they soften the edges, blur the betrayal, not because they believe it, but because they can't bear the weight of the truth. They need a version of the story that makes them the protagonist, and if they have to erase your pain to do that, they will. I used to want to correct their version, to stand up and shout, "That's not how it happened." But now, I see that silence is stronger, because no matter what they tell themselves, they both wake up alone, and I wake up with peace. That's a reality no story they invent can undo. Harper once asked me, "Do you think he regrets it?" I thought for a while before answering. "Maybe," I said, "but regret is just a bruise. What they lost, that's permanent. Because when someone betrays you while you're vulnerable, they don't just break trust, they shatter their own reflection, and the cracks don't heal easily." She squeezed my hand. "They thought you'd disappear," she whispered. "Instead, you built an empire." I smiled. Because I hadn't built an empire. I'd built a life, one they could never enter again, not even as a memory. That's the power of healing. When you don't have to erase someone, you just outgrow them so completely, they no longer fit into your future. Success used to feel like a finish line, something far off, marked by applause, recognition, maybe a big number in your bank account. But now success feels like mornings without tension, like laughing without suspicion, like sitting in silence without waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's what betrayal teaches you, what real peace costs, and what it's worth. I stopped chasing growth just for growth's sake. I started mentoring again, quietly one-on-one. I took fewer clients, focused more on impact. I worked with people who reminded me of who I used to be, tired, overlooked, still believing in something bigger. That's where I poured my energy now. Harper and I adopted a dog, a rescue with a torn ear and gentle eyes. We named him Echo, a quiet tribute to the voice I almost lost. He follows me from room to room, sleeps beside my desk while I write. He doesn't need anything flashy, just consistency, presence. The same things I now value most. We bought a small house near the mountains. Nothing fancy, just space to breathe, a porch to sit on, a fireplace for slow evenings. I planted a garden with my own hands, watched something grow from scratch again. This time, no one could steal it. No one could call it worthless. Sometimes I look at old photos, not out of longing, but to honor the man who survived. He deserved to be seen. Even if no one clapped for him back then, I clap for him now, because he stayed soft when he had every reason to harden, and that softness became his strength. That's what success finally feels like, not being known by the world, but being known fully by yourself. One night Harper found a draft in my email unsent. It was written to my ex-wife. Long, honest, unfiltered. It told the whole story, what I felt in the hospital, what I learned after, what I never said out loud. She asked if I wanted to send it. I shook my head. "No," I said. "She doesn't deserve my clarity." And it was true. The message wasn't for her. It was for me. To say what needed to be said, and then leave it behind. I deleted it the next morning. Not in anger, in release. We live in a world where we think closure comes from confrontation, but it doesn't. Closure comes when the truth stops hurting, when you can tell your story without your hands shaking, when you can walk past their name without flinching. I started writing again, Not for work, for myself. Essays, letters, reflections. I wrote to the man I used to be, the one who was left in a hospital bed, forgotten. I told him, "You made it. You didn't turn bitter. You didn't sink. You rose with both hands still open." That's the story I carry now. Not of betrayal, but of becoming, of rebuilding a life so true, so rooted, that even grief couldn't uproot it. And I offer it to anyone who needs it, because sometimes someone else's silence can become your survival map. 1 year later, I was asked to speak at a summit on resilience, leadership, and quiet power. I stood on the stage not as a victim, not as a headline, but as a man who had learned the hardest way possible, that you don't have to shout to be unshakable. I told my story not with fire, but with focus. I talked about betrayal without naming names. I talked about rebuilding without revenge. And when I finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then it filled with applause. But I wasn't listening for claps. I was listening for peace. And it was there in every pause, in every breath. Afterward, a young man approached me, eyes wide, voice low. "How do you forgive someone who never apologized?" he asked. I smiled. "You stop waiting," I said, "and you start living." He nodded, like something in him had finally unlocked. That night, Harper and I sat on our porch. She rested her head on my shoulder, echo at our feet. The stars were out. I closed my eyes and whispered something I hadn't said aloud before. This is the life I was meant to live. Not the one they tried to steal, not the one they walked away from, but the one I built in silence. And this time, no one could take it away.